Good evening. Welcome to our interview tonight with Laura Acasio, candidate for State Senate District 1 in Hilo. First, I'd like to say a little bit about HULI PAC. We are a group of grassroots community advocates volunteering our time to HULI PAC. Many of us have witnessed during oral testimonies the problem of being the minority voice, observing seated representatives voting against the āina, or the majority of testifiers. The majority rule currently allows the continuation of colonial structures, corporate rule, and methods over Ike Hawaii for āina and its people to thrive. We must collectively understand the individual power we carry as Hawai'i Island residents by getting involved. We stay curious, jump into opportunities for positive change, ask why, observe, listen, and find problem-solving solutions. The toughest of all is when we don't see our vision supported. We must recognize the urgency to uplift leaders who can be the change we value. The political system, as we know it, thrives when we turn our backs. We surround ourselves with trusted advisors, our kapuna, guiding the path towards deepening our cultural foundation and knowledge to create the future we want for generations to come. Conducting our interviews tonight are Phil Barnes and Michaela Okuchi. Phil, first question, please.
Surely. Good afternoon, Senator Acasio. So first question we're going to start off with is your personal values, just to get a little general background. What has inspired you to run for this office again at this time? Please describe your core values, being what is most important to you, and how would you apply these values to Hawai'i Island's future?
First of all, thank you so much to HULI PAC and to all you three here tonight, those watching, and also all the behind the scenes efforts that go into a production like this, and also all of your folks' civic engagement and advocacy. So just wanted to really mahalo you. Thank you for the question. So core values, fundamentally, I go back to one key statement, which is leave a place better than you find it. But that becomes really layered and nuanced if you really think about it, because, you know, some of the values that come with that is also perhaps ask first or watch and listen, you know, make observations about whether it's even appropriate to make, especially if it's something that is, if you're leaving someplace better, what is, you know, whose perspective is better, for example. And so it really comes down to observing folks that are in the space, but especially our indigenous population here in Hawaii and folks that have come here before me. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I've lived in Hawaii for over 30 years. And I was raised with values of community, sharing, regeneration. So, you know, really looking at the inequalities and how to live a life of service in the sense of helping to contribute to a more egalitarian community. And so things that are valuable to me are, in terms of like economy, would be circular economy, would be love, and making sure that when we're looking at how successful a community or a culture or a government, a country, for example, is by looking at how many folks are without. That gives you a really good judgment as to how much work we need to do in order to fix that. So I think what brings me to running for office, however, is seeing that and knowing that I have energy and charisma in terms of doing the work and putting in the time and hard work that it takes. So of course, that also means hard work is a value. And that listening as a skill set is an incredibly important part of being a senator and a servant leader. And even just coming in my life for my entire life is knowing that being of service is an incredible value to our community. So that, you know, one of the things that I see as opportunities to collaborate and to kind of shift away from what I see as fear-based politics or money-based politics to community-based civic engagement. And with a history of being a teacher, so much of that becomes education or communication to community, teaching process, being open to resilient, you know, to questions about process. So I'll just leave it at that, but really putting efforts in towards clean elections and jumping in a way that is fundamentally supported by the constituency.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Michaela, our next question.
Okay, so my first question is kind of pivoting a little bit and going to affordable housing. As you know, affordable housing is a major issue, not just on Hawai'i Island, but throughout Hawaii. So what are some of your solutions to the affordable housing crisis in Hawaii?
Mahalo nui for that question. It's super loaded, right? Because if we're talking about affordability, we can't address that question without even looking at cost of living, land, especially with what we've seen in the past even 4 years of the shift for in how much land is costing. We have to talk about investment and investment properties. Whenever we're talking about affordable housing, I think two of the most fundamental questions to bring in the forefront is what is affordable, first of all, because I think a lot of times in the language in the legislation, at least that I have come across, and even the conversations, is to really think critically about what does that mean? And there's multi-levels of housing that's needed in our community. And so I think ultimately we have to, again, it's a systemic issue as to why we're in this crisis to begin with, in terms of speculation, cost of living. The fact that housing is not affordable and to so many, and that so many have to move off island or can't afford to stay or have to live in multi-generational families is really a consequence of systemic failure. And so some of the solutions would be looking at using what we had just recently, a bill in the legislature, and it's been introduced multiple years in a row, is conveyance taxes, for example, on luxury housing. And then to use that money, because oftentimes you hear is, oh, we don't have the money, or there's not money for services or different support systems that come with housing. But this is an opportunity to be able to get housing. And it also, in a lot of ways, there are ways to discourage investments or flipping of housing, which again drives prices up. So I think also, you know, we aren't going to build ourselves out of our problem, but a lot of it has to do with looking at communities that are more transportation oriented developments that have a lot of mixed use, and where even the neighborhood I live in, for example, we have senior housing, we have apartments, we have some single family housing, but there's also accessory dwelling units, and being able to have ohana units, for example, that folks can live in. So the second question to really be examining critically when we're talking about affordable housing is affordable for who, right? And that is it's a conversation that's happening statewide. Of course, in the state of Hawaii, there's this discussion about whether it's constitutional in terms of preventing folks outside of Hawaii from purchasing housing, for example, or even rent, even priority lists for renting, for example. But we really do need to look at that. And we have to look at mechanisms to prioritize that. Another perfect example is we have veterans housing coming up for our community, which is a really amazing opportunity. And at the same time, we have to really make sure that there are procedures and policy in place so that our veterans from Hilo who are housing insecure or even homeless have opportunities in that space, as opposed to just, putting it out in general to anyone in the world so that it becomes more of a retirement home. And it's a really tricky conversation, and there's a lot of variables to discuss, but we have to be looking at that. And I think one of the biggest things in community that I hear is we want to house folks here, as opposed to just continuing a tap that's left on that continues to flow and then really changes the fabric completely of our communities.
Thank you. Phil, next question.
Yes, the next question, Senator, deals with political progress. Now, having served a term before in the Senate, this is something you can relate directly to. So the basic question is, do you think the current state legislature is effective? If yes, why? If not, what needs improvement? What specifically would you do, and how would you accomplish this goal?
So right off the top of my head, there are a number of things that can be done without legislation, and things like committees can always hold public votes. I think something really critical to look at is the Sunshine Law, and how there are conversations around whether, because when the legislature passed the Sunshine Law, they exempted the legislature. And that creates opportunities for less transparency. And having recently joined the Environmental Management Commission here on the county and being subject to Sunshine Law, I also I've experienced and see the limitations of how long it takes to have a conversation on certain issues, because you're really restricted to having those conversations 100% on, in public view, which, again, as someone who really supports transparency in governance, it's super important, but we have to be able to have deep conversations with multiple stakeholders about an issue in a way that is accountable to our community, and yet you can't always wait an entire month to have a conversation, especially if you have 51 House representatives or 25 legislators that need to really hash out issues. But what I do think we can do is we can have public votes, and we can have those conversations during committee online instead of offline. I don't really see why it needs to happen offline. And I think that promotes goodwill. It brings up ideas. It allows our constituents to really see our thought processes and the concerns that we have, and we can bring them up. And then much more explanation as to why we are voting the way we are. I think that's important. I think things like putting defective dates on things and sending everything to conference committee, that can be something that we decide with rulemaking not to do. For example, we could have opportunities where legislators at this point have chairships, and they can change, but there can be a much more egalitarian way to have those chairships, so that, and of course it's important for a chair to know their subject matter as well, but to be able to have a much more egalitarian process in choosing, maybe a rotation, or what bills get heard and what bills don't get heard. I think often, I heard it in your introduction, for example, is that oftentimes it could have, well, let's take the midwifery restriction law. There was a bill proposed in last year's legislature to change some of the restriction and discrimination. And in the first hearing, there was 1,300 testimony in support, but the bill never made it out of the House. And so, and generally speaking, even 800 in a committee of testimony and support is extremely high. So there was a lot of testimony and a lot of interest in the community. And yet, the perspective from most advocates is that one person or two people, or even just the tight leadership of the House, prevented that from passing forward. And so we have to get away from practices like that, where the public input and the importance to the community is completely disregarded.
Thank you. Next question.
So my next question is about Pohakuloa and land management, specifically regarding Native Hawaiian rights. So the Army will lose its lease to 23,000 acres of state land at Pohakuloa in 2029. Many residents have been opposed to the Army renewing their lease, citing concerns regarding the military's history of land mismanagement and lack of transparency. What is your awareness of this issue? What outcome would you like to see in 2029, and how will you work towards your vision?
That's a very, very important question. And I just mahalo you for that question. It definitely comes with complexities, again, just like most. I recognize that as a senator and a representative community, my biggest obligation is to be present in as many of the conversations in their entirety as possible. So to listen. My second obligation is to advocate. Actually, I'm sorry, is to communicate. So share about process, help to educate and inform community about when things are coming up in the legal process. Because, for example, I'm aware that at least within the next few months, I'm imagining, there is a second draft of the environmental impact statement that will be released from the Army, and that folks will have opportunities on our island to give testimony and feedback, and to read through the draft EIS and give comments and ask questions, especially in the form of what's relevant and what is stated in the EIS. And for me personally, I think the biggest key is to listen to the perspectives and to understanding the history is of military occupation. That's first and foremost, is I have to come from that place and do the due diligence and look at the history, look at, I think I really look forward to reading the draft EIS and, using my own skill set and ideas that come and take notes and pose them out in my community, and also sharing feedback with the EIS. I did introduce a bill in 2022, and it was then reintroduced this year by Senator Shimabukuro, that leases in the state need to be in compliance with their lease agreement. So for example, they cannot be in arrears, they cannot have financial obligations. If they are supposed to have, they have obligations to keep the land in a certain condition, or the buildings, then their lease obligations, they are not allowed, the state would not follow through with reassigning the lease because they're out of compliance. And I think of that in any form of being a landlord, for example, or if I was lending out my car to somebody. And it goes back to that value of leave a place better than you find it, is I most likely people aren't going to re-rent a house to someone who's neglectful and even intentionally harming it, right? And destroying it. And so similar should be applied to any of these situations. And I think one of the last key things on it is that, $1 a year has been a slap in the face, to say the least, in terms of a lease rent as well. And it really becomes critical to see what the new lease terms presented will be, because I think, again, that's part of the legal process, and just my obligation then is really to understand the laws and the consultation process, and then make sure that all of these pieces are being followed. So in terms of how I'm going to accomplish that is, again, I know for a fact I'll be at the public input. I think it's very important that public have opportunity I think the consultation, though, the process for consultation, which we've seen in our more recent history, is consultation comes after the fact. And then it just becomes kind of a standard operating procedure to have a night or a day where folks come give testimony and then the input is not incorporated. It's actually more critical to be reaching out to folks ahead of time and engaging them in the entire process, as opposed to as a last end result and kind of like a formality. And I think, yeah, so I would just continue to encourage folks to show up, and that this is not, none of this is actually a new conversation. So
Thank you. Phil, next question.
Yes, Senator. What critical issues have arisen in your Senate district since your last term in office that could be addressed by the state legislature, and how do you plan to address them?
Well, I can think of one that happened just last week, or it's been an ongoing encroachment of our boat harbors and deterioration of our small boat harbor here in Wailoa. So Wailoa Small Boat Harbor does not have a bathroom. The moorings are falling apart and broken. The bumpers are falling apart. The ramp is falling apart. It's been in immense neglect for multiple reasons. So it's about really learning the history and looking into why that is. And currently we have an emergency situation in the sense that our fishermen's livelihood and anyone that has boating operations that rely on it for their livelihood or cultural practice or wellness the sandbar has completely encroached and blocking access in and out of Wailoa Boat Harbor. So some of the things that we've done, there was a community meeting recently. A lot of these questions came up, and if I'm remembering the exact question, what would I do if I was a senator? Well, immediately as a senator, I would call a public, what do they call, an informational briefing. And I would ask DOBOR and the director of DOBOR to be present. I would ask the governor or the governor's replacement if possible, and for the director, Don Chang, to be present and their staff, so that questions for the community can be asked and answered, as opposed to we don't know, we'll get back to kind of thing. Because a lot of folks in my community are very frustrated with the fact that there is no ocean access basically for over 2/3 of the island that is open and safe. We have the closure of Pohoiki with the lava flow in 2018. And so Wailoa Small Boat Harbor has been the only entry point for all the way into Kauai High. And being that it's blocked, it's an incredible safety issue. So it's, calling on our governor to look at the situation and hopefully act in as if it is an emergency, because it is, and it's going to affect livelihoods in our community. So really just to work with our area representatives. So we've called our representatives, we've alerted the governor's office, helped to organize the boating and fishing community, because oftentimes they're busy doing their work and their livelihoods. They're not, ma'atu advocating at the legislature, for example. So that is the duty, and is to recognize what issues are arising in our community and act immediately to help, again, give folks explanation of where they could use their voice. For example, just asking them to call their representatives. But if I was currently senator, that's what I would do, is be calling the governor and asking for emergency dredging, and to be working with the community that uses that facility in order to do it in a way that is befitting of the community.
Thank you. Next question.
Relates more to a global issue. Do you support a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and or an end to military aid to Israel, and why or why not?
Absolutely, 100%. As an State Central Committee representative for Senate District 1, I didn't write the resolution, but we definitely in agreement and support and passing a resolution early on to call for an immediate ceasefire and ending funding to genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And I have done the best I can to do my due diligence and read and understand the history as much as I can from afar, but there is no excuse, no way to condone at all what is happening. And when I see that globally, though, we see it in many different forms, right? We see it as like more slow genocide, as in many occupations throughout history and currently in Hawaii. And some of those, some of those genocides become social determinants of health, for example, or social determinants of poverty being one of those things. And for example, our military industrial complex having such a high percentage of Native Hawaiian and people of color. And it really does all tie in. So I absolutely support it. And honestly, I don't understand any reason, any rationale for not supporting it.
Thank you. Bill, next question.
Yes. What organizations are you working with to try to identify ways to mitigate over tourism? What are some of the avenues and examples of models that could be used on Hawai'i Island?
So we do in Keaukaha, there's an organization that I am not closely tied with, but I have been paying attention to their social media posts and also connecting with folks that are close. They've been taking count for multiple years, probably into their 4th year now, of visitors coming to the shoreline and impacts that they see as a result. So that's one here locally. I've also been staying very closely connected with folks that are discussing Banyan Drive revitalization efforts, and otherwise known actually as Waiakea Kai Peninsula, and really looking at regenerative models. What does the community input, in really getting community input as opposed to, again, what we talked about, which is after the fact, and looking at circular models that incorporate promotion of our agriculture. So local food production, especially regenerative practices of food production, and a much more, again, going back to that value of leave a place better than you find it, is that shifting the idea of Mai Tai and a beach vacation to one where A, you're invited, B, and of course, this gets very tricky in terms of discussions, but this, what does malama mean in terms of actually putting it into practice, as opposed to it just being another catchy tourism model? And so really looking at how we can connect things like reuse infrastructure and getting away from imports and plastic for an entire community, based on connecting the dots to our local agricultural system to our visitor industry, right? So which means farm to table, which means experiential learning where volunteerism is critical. A lot of times we have opportunities for folks to learn and put in work. Most people who farm know that the biggest difficulty is, well, a lot of it is housing and affordability, right? But it's really about the work. If you have to pay folks to work on your farm, but many folks want to have a bigger experience. It's not just about Mai Tai, but at the same time, we operating, for me to speak that as a settler, and B, also every community and every island needs to have much more home rule and input around what that looks like and who is being served. Again, that's why circular is so important, because again, if we just continue to have money extracted off island, then when we as a state give our reports as to how much income tourism has brought in this year, it's really not accurate if a majority of the monies that we're putting in that data set is extracted to large corporations who they might own fifth homes here or second homes, but they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily going back into that mom and pop circular economy that's supporting folks who are living here and who are invested in time, energy, and care about the place. So again, just kind of getting away from extractive models. So I've been in communication around Waiakekai with many, many stakeholders, right holders, and organizations, different state, county, you name it, to really have conversations. I've been working with Richard Onishi, Representative Onishi, on that extensively. When we were having some issues in 2021 around RFPs that had gone out in our community that were being looked at by the Board of Land and Natural Resources, the question was, is this our best? Or is it just, you know, whatever is low-hanging fruit, whatever, it's all we can get kind of thing. What is our vision for really what and who that space serves and how it serves? And so if we look to things like education models, it's really helpful. But I reached out to OHA in that case. And then again, I was as a senator at that time. So I reached out to OHA, I reached out to āina Aloha Economic Futures and folks involved in that organization, because they do have a really clear checklist and a model for how we look at developments. And that checklist is valuable. It has a lot of regenerative and circular economy written into it. And if it doesn't pass muster, we figure out either how it can or, you know, try again. So there's a lot of ways to, you know, take opportunities to influence that. But I think, again, going back to the real point is to listen to community. And again, different community members are going to have different needs. So it's really about collaboration and trying to find innovative ways to go, okay, what do we all agree on? What is the commonality? And then how to get there. And I think one of the fundamental things that I hear in our community, specifically Hilo, is we want to keep Hilo Hilo, but we also want it to be vibrant. We want people to be able to stay here. We want people to be able to thrive here. And so looking at, again, that's why that circular model really comes in, and it ties in with our agriculture. It ties in with zero waste. It ties in with Kuleana, and Auntie Twinkles of Wai'anae says it the best. Kuleana builds mana. That is for our unsheltered population, but it's actually for everyone. Everyone has to have purpose.
Thank you. Next question.
My next question is, do you support the legalization of cannabis, and under what terms?
Well, that's a big one. And again, I'm going to fly a couple words like equity and justice, but equity and justice, when you really look at it, if I'm being honest, is redistribution of wealth. It's about land back. It's about really acknowledging that people have had all these collateral damages in life because of possession of marijuana and have served time. So I think, yes, I do. At the same time, I need to continue to learn all the nuances because I know it's complicated. What I want to see in our particular legalization for recreational use is, again, that embedded decriminalization, especially for folks that are incarcerated. I want to see it tied to agriculture for local consumption. And what I mean by that is because otherwise it becomes another cash crop, which Hawaii has had a history in colonization of, pineapple, sugar, and other extractive, or even coffee to some degree, although it's in some ways it's a much more smaller scale and maybe more gourmet, but nonetheless, it's still an export crop in general. And so if it's not tied to local agriculture for local consumption, then what would prevent large scale land use practices that, again, oftentimes are extractive? And also, I really believe that we need to look at protecting our legacy growers and folks who have been growing for many years and all the specific strains, as opposed to it being, in a lot of ways, I just feel there's a lot that needs to be looked at in terms of corporatizing, and also the fear, and it's real, about preventing personal growth, individual folks to grow. Because if it becomes, there, and then of course there's safety issues to look at all of that, but really looking at how, for example, you can grow tomatoes and you can also buy tomatoes at a store. So same thing with a dispensary model. You can purchase in a dispensary, but then also there's nothing preventing. We need to make sure that we can preserve individual rights to grow. And I also just want to add that I do have a lot more to learn on this. And I went recently to a Transforming Food Systems Together summit, which was incredible. I learned so much, and there were so many different people there wanting to make great change to make sure that Hawaii ends hunger and food insecurity at a fundamental justice level. And one of the tables was about adult use recreational marijuana legalization. And so I sat at that table on purpose because I wanted to listen to all of the mana'o coming from folks at that table, because I don't know everything, right? And that's the nature of being a senator. You kind of have to know at least a little bit about everything, but more importantly, you have to be willing to learn. You have to be able to read and, go through all the arguments, and then just really use your own sense and due diligence in consulting what is the best for the greatest good. So mahalo for that question.
Thank you. Over to you, Phil.
Yeah, the next couple of questions deal with climate change. So a couple of different ways we're going to look at it here is Hawaii's top emitting sector is transportation. So what plans do you have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector? And do you see any exciting opportunities for climate change mitigation and jobs in your Senate district?
That's a great question. More bikes? Just being honest. But I am an avid biker, and it does rain, and there's a lot of infrastructure improvements. But actually, all jokes aside, I actually really would love to see more transportation-oriented developments, and developments that are much more geared around centers and walkable, especially walkable and bikeable centers, and ones that have public transportation. Yeah, good public transportation, really. And especially if we're talking about energy, I know Hawai'i Island is piloting some electric buses, and my understanding is that it's getting better, the quality and the distance and such. And so really looking at yeah, it becomes tricky, to be honest, because I am a believer that we do need to get away from fossil fuels, but I really struggle with all of the mining of the products for solar and cobalt and, all of our devices. And, a lot of the narrative is that that's better than oil. And honestly, I feel like the information is always going to be skewed to the folks that are pushing the issue. So again, in this particular concept, I have a lot to learn. I didn't sit on the Energy and Transportation Committee, and I know if I had for the past 2 years, I would have a much more knowledge base around it. But I do think it is something that is very important when we're looking at developments. And so I think I can address this really in the way that if we continue to do more urban sprawl or developing communities like how Puna was developed, in just kind of with no long range planning. Just throw it in there, just a little bit of history. My dad is a long-range planner, and he was one of the administrators for the Board of Public Works growing up in Los Angeles, for the city of Los Angeles. And so a lot of the conversations around the dinner table were absolutely about long-range planning and what that actually looks like for reducing our carbon input, our carbon footprint. I do know it's very important, and I feel like we're really at this crisis moment where that's honestly the best example is, and it's not realistic to say everyone needs to ride bikes, but the more we can get to places where we have good public transportation is really a key.
Okay, next question.
So my next question is on food security. If Hawaii is cut off from continental resources for an extended period of time due to a natural or human-caused disaster, Hawai'i Island cannot feed its residents without food imports. What is your definition of food security or food sovereignty? And what type of legislation would you support that contributes to overarching food sovereignty for Hawai'i Island?
So I wish I had memorized the priorities from the Transforming Hawaii Food Systems Together, but that was a collaborative, and it's imperative that the legislature push all of those issues. Number one, I do remember farm to school is a really big one, and I did introduce the Senate companion for those bills when I was in the state Senate in 2021 and 2022, is to be right away starting with our food security through developing curriculum, or actually implementing curriculum in schools. This is actually a huge passion of mine as a teacher, and I've worked in the garden. One of our big projects that we had for 7 years was a community garden here at the Boys and Girls Club that was started by community organizing, and this idea, and this was in 2003. So it was inspired by Ma'o Farms and what they had been doing in Wai'anae to start, cultivating and feeding and doing organic farming and learning about soil and growing food, specifically because food security is like, our insecurity is life-threatening. And it actually is for people who are currently food insecure. But to top it off, when the barges stop coming. And so it's been a passion of mine forever is to help planting seeds with our youth to develop their culinary expertise in terms of, and their growing of food. So farm to school is a big one. I know a lot of the ideas that came out of that food summit were incredible. And I don't think our community is short of these ideas and implementation. But I think number one is to put our money where our mouth is. Because right now, if we don't fund these things as a state, it's technically not a priority. And so I think a big part of it is really to start using our systems that we already have in place and funding support for agriculture. And let me start, actually, I forgot this one piece, which is biosecurity. We can't talk about food security without talking about CRB, coconut, the Queensland longhorn beetle, even fire ants, which used to feel like a really big threat, are technically not. It feels so minor compared to some of these ones. And Hawaii has actually failed for many years in food security, food biosecurity when it comes to that. And we have models. I know Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a much better model, and they really do cherish their agriculture. And so, but a big part of their agriculture is absolutely biosecurity. And I don't see that as a really important topic at the legislature, and it needs to be championed. And we need to look at some of the models of where some of our pests are coming in. And again, it goes back to people over profit, right? So a lot of the times that we cut corners, and this goes for anything, food security, development, what have you, when we start cutting corners on these things, it's actually Hawaii people that lose. And so the reason why those, things are present is because it actually protects.
Okay.
Good
Okay, thank you. We're out of time for this evening. Thank you, Senator Acasio, for joining us, and thanks to both our interviewers, Michaela and Phil. Really terrific interview. One thing I'd like to do is encourage everybody to vote. It's the most important thing you can do. Ask your friends and your family to vote as well. The more people that vote, the better representation we're going to have. At HULI PAC, we are building something that Hawaii's never seen before, a slate of pono leaders. For more information, please log into hulihi.com. That's HULIHI.com. Thanks again, and have a great evening.
Oh, thank you, folks.